For 24 years, Kiki the gorilla sat in silence, abandoned by the only human she ever trusted. Zoo officials dismissed her withdrawal as age, ignoring the heartbreak she carried. But when Dan Harper stood before her glass one quiet morning, everything changed in a single step. And what happened next will leave you breathless. Because justice, at last, found its way home. It was one of those warm, golden Saturdays in Milwaukee, the kind that lingers in memory. Sunlight filtered through the canopy of oaks and maples in the city zoo, dappling the winding paths with patterns of light and shadow. Children's laughter echoed like birdsong through the park. Young couples strolled hand in hand, sharing cotton candy. Parents pushed strollers, sipped iced coffee, and paused now and then to admire a flamingo, a lion, or the distant trumpet of an elephant. But the biggest crowd, the one that rippled with quiet anticipation, gathered around the gorilla habitat. Not for a show, not for a performance, but for her, Kiki. At 32 years old, Kiki was the oldest resident in the primate section, and arguably its most mysterious. She was large, powerful, stoic, a living relic of a story most had forgotten, except those who worked closest to her. Her eyes, dark and deep as dusk, held something ancient, and today, for reasons no one could yet explain, the energy around her enclosure was different. Kiki's story hadn't begun in Milwaukee. It began decades earlier, across an ocean, beneath the towering trees of Central Africa, in the lowland forests of the Congo. She was barely a week old when poachers shattered her world. In the chaos, her mother was lost. Kiki, frightened and crying, was found by a young American zoologist named Daniel Harper, not as a scientist, but as a human with trembling hands and a breaking heart. He took her in, wrapped her in warm fabric, fed her with a bottle, slept on the floor beside her, sang to her in the quiet of the night when she couldn't sleep. He named her Kiki, and in time, she stopped crying. Dan became more than a caretaker. He was her entire world. For 8 years, their bond deepened, through shared moments, routine rituals, and gentle touches. When she was relocated to the U.S. as part of a long-term conservation program, Dan came with her. She didn't understand the language of cages or crowds, but as long as Dan was near, she didn't need to. Then one day, he was gone. No goodbye, no familiar voice, no warm scent on the wind, just absence. Zookeepers said he had retired, quietly left after a health issue, but they didn't see what Kiki felt, the way she stopped playing, stopped vocalizing, the way she sat in the corner of her enclosure for hours, tracing circles in the dirt with a fingertip. They labeled it trauma-related adaptation. Some called it depression. Others said she'd simply grown quiet with age, but the truth was simpler. She was grieving. Now, on this sunny Saturday, she sat exactly as she had for years, beneath the shade of the artificial cliff wall, back turned to the crowd, still, silent, unreachable. Until something shifted. In the swarm of Saturday visitors, one figure moved slower than the rest. A man, hunched, silver-haired, wrapped in a weathered ranger jacket, with faded patches and years of dust stitched into every seam. He walked like a man unsure if the ground would hold beneath him. His name was Daniel Harper. He had suffered a stroke years ago, moved to Idaho, lost his speech for a time, lost his wife soon after. For a while, he'd stopped living and simply existed. Until one afternoon, his grandson showed him a trending video on a tablet. "They say she doesn't respond to anyone anymore," the boy said. "You think she remembers you?" Dan didn't reply, but in his chest, something old stirred. Not hope, not exactly. Just the need to know. So he came. And now, standing before the thick pane of reinforced glass, he waited. The crowd, sensing something strange in the air, fell silent. Inside the enclosure, Kiki froze. Her shoulders twitched, her head turned slowly. Her nostrils flared, catching something familiar. A scent, a memory, a ripple in time. Then, from somewhere deep in her chest, she let out a low, trembling vocalization, a sound none of the staff had heard in over 2 decades, a soft, resonant call that belonged to a different time and a different version of her. The crowd inhaled, Kiki rose. Her movements were deliberate, hesitant, as if she feared the moment might vanish if she rushed. Her eyes locked on Dan, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, wonder, disbelief. Dan lifted a trembling hand. Kiki stopped, tilted her head, and then she took a step. Just one. But it cracked time in half. The crowd didn't breathe. Phones shook in hands. Children asked quiet questions. But all eyes stayed fixed on a 32-year-old gorilla who had just remembered the man who once held her like a daughter. And in that stillness, something ancient stirred. Not just in Kiki, in all of us. At first, it seemed like nothing more than coincidence, just a curious movement, a shift in posture, the kind of thing even seasoned zookeepers might dismiss as a routine. A gorilla simply approached the glass. That was all. But those who had worked with Kiki for years knew better. She didn't come to the edge of her enclosure. Not anymore. Not in nearly 2 decades. Guests often lingered, hoping to catch a glimpse, only to leave disappointed. Kiki avoided the front wall like it held ghosts. Because for her, perhaps, it did. She hadn't just withdrawn from humans. She had erased them from her world, not out of fear in the way we imagine fear, but from something quieter, absence of trust, absence of reason. As if, over time, she decided people simply weren't worth noticing anymore. And yet, here she was, moving closer. Each step was deliberate, slow, as if she were walking a fragile rope between memory and doubt. Her massive frame seemed to tremble with something deeper than instinct. When she reached the glass, she didn't pound or pace or inspect. She sat directly across from him. Dan didn't move. Neither did she. Their eyes locked. The kind of gaze that doesn't look at someone, but into them. As the breeze shifted, it carried something with it, faint, but unmistakable. A scent she had once known as safety. Worn leather, earth, sweat, and the soft, unwashed canvas of a ranger's coat. That was all it took. Kiki tilted her head to the side, slowly, thoughtfully, and then, with startling grace, dropped to one knee. Her breath was steady. Her gaze did not break. She raised her arm, strong and deliberate, and placed her palm gently against the glass. On the other side, Dan mirrored her. 2 hands, 3 inches of glass, 24 years of silence. For a moment, the entire zoo vanished. The crowds, the cameras, the vendors, and the rustling trees, all of it blurred into nothingness, except for this impossible reunion unfolding in real time. Somewhere in the watching crowd, a woman began to cry. A child clutched his father's hand in silence. Phones were raised, yes, but no one spoke above a whisper. The air itself seemed to pause. And then, the sound, barely audible at first, a clicking rhythm, soft, deliberate, and ancient. It came from Kiki's mouth, not random, not animalistic. It was patterned, familiar, like a lullaby without melody. Those close enough to hear felt a chill, because it was the same sound Dan used to make, back when she was no bigger than a toddler, a pattern of tongue and teeth, soft and calming. He used it to help her sleep, to tell her she was safe. And now, she was echoing it back. There was no doubt. She remembered him. By the next morning, the footage had made its way to every corner of the internet. Gorilla recognizes her keeper after 24 years, read headlines across major networks. News anchors choked up mid-broadcast. Scientists debated the extent of primate memory. But beyond the buzz and speculation, something deeper began to stir. Questions. Why had Kiki been left so isolated for so long? Why wasn't there a companion animal, a dedicated caretaker, even a behavioral enrichment specialist monitoring her emotional well-being? And more pressing, how had the story of her bond with Dan been lost to time? Criticism rained down on the zoo's director, George Langston, a man known more for budgets than backstories. Emails flooded his inbox. Journalists requested statements. Animal rights groups demanded investigations. And for the first time in his career, Langston faced something more daunting than PR damage. He faced the truth. Kiki hadn't been distant because she was old. She had been grieving, in silence, in waiting. And that moment at the glass wasn't just recognition, it was forgiveness. A week later, under public pressure, the zoo let Kiki and Dan meet face to face. No glass. She walked in slowly and hugged him, gently, like she remembered everything, like she'd been waiting. Dan cried, so did the staff, so did the internet. From that day on, they met every morning at 10. Kiki changed, she played again, trusted again. She even reached out to a little girl one afternoon. She didn't just remember him, she healed.